Well, it's a new decade, which means there's going to be a new Transatlantic album, and right on cue, here we are. So let's dive into this beast. The Absolute Universe by Transatlantic. So, I feel like Transatlantic at this point doesn't even really need an introduction, but for those of you that are uninitiative of a Transatlantic, they are the big supergroup of the progressive rock genre at the moment. I mean, we've got a lot of different supergroups, a lot of different projects that other members of different bands have come together to work on. But Transatlantic really started that trend in the early 2000s. We have Neil Morse from Spock's Beard at that time, drummer Mike Portnoy from Dream Theater at that time, Roland Stahl from Flower Kings, and Pete Travis from Marillion, all coming together and creating this ultimate supergroup of progressive rock, because a lot of these bands were really at the pinnacle of their success. Like, they had just crossed the outside of Marillion, crest the wave of success, and were being blasted off into the stratosphere. Now, the first two albums, even though I love Stamped and I love Bridge Across Forever, at the end of the day, they did feel like projects rather than a band. Even though, as I mentioned, they're one of my favorites, Bridge Across Forever is in tie with my favorite album of theirs, I did feel like it was a lot of Neil Morse's personalities and not a whole lot of Pete or Rowan. And Mike was kind of, doing what he does best in providing that heartbeat, being that soul for the band. But the next album of The Whirlwind, released in 2009, I believe it was, really showed the band of Transatlantic. It was a single track in 80 minutes. It's, again, Bridge Across Forever and The Whirlwind are very close to being my favorite album from them. And then 2 years later, they put out Kaleidoscope, which wasn't my favorite. I felt like they were retreading a lot of the same ground and kind of the same area. And I felt like if they took a longer hiatus between their next release, it would allow each member to experiment within their own sandbox, within their own creative endeavors of their own bands, and then come back and kind of see what kind of blends together. Now we come into being a new decade. They started a new album with The Absolute Universe, and there's a lot to talk about within this album because it's such a strange and interesting project that I have to applaud the boys for trying something completely new. And I want to say this right at the beginning because I feel like this is really what progressive rock is all about. It's about stretching the boundaries of what music is, trying new things, trying experiments, just letting creativity flow and presenting music that nobody has done before. Because this is something that nobody has actually done before. And I really, really do applaud them for trying something new. I do feel like progressive rock now has gotten very docile, has gotten very stagnant. They're not really pushing the boundaries all that much. They're looking back into yesteryear and not really moving forward. And I mean, with a genre such as progressive rock, they're not really progressing all that much. They're just kind of staying where they're at. So I need to applaud every single one of the creativity that's behind this in deciding to produce this album in two different expressions. And I think that's the best way to talk about this album. Is it's the same album expressed in two different ways, because I don't really feel comfortable in saying that these are two separate albums, because they're not, but I'm also not comfortable with saying that they're the same album that's just an abridged version and an extended version, because it's also not. It's the same album expressed in two different ways. And reviewing this, I was thinking, well, do I want to do two reviews for each of these albums, or do I want to do one review where I look at both of them together? I think the best way is to talk about them in like as a complete work, and then talk about each work separately, and then how each one kind of balances off one another. Because I think, at least for me, one of my favorite things about this album was seeing how they differ for one another. Because one thing that I know a lot of people are going to be asking is, which one is better? And honestly, I don't think that's the right question. I don't think that's even a good or fair question, because neither one is better than the other. It's just a different expression, as I mentioned before. So if you're coming into this project wondering which album is better, that's not the question to be asking. It's stop, just need to grab my cabbage rolls. Because if you come into this album thinking which one of these albums are better, I think that's really unfair to this project because neither one is better than the other. My favorite aspect of this album, at least for me, is getting really deep into each of these albums and then finding out where they differ. You know, what is it that is connecting me to this project versus the other one? Which one am I really enjoying more? Which one do I really want to sit down and think about? And I think that is going to be one of the biggest things, the biggest takeaways from these two expressions is sitting down and thinking about how each one is being presented and how the presentation of the music is actually affecting the enjoyment of it. So in that sense, this album is just a complete success because I had a blast getting really deep into each one, getting myself familiar with one, and then listening to the expression in a different way, in a different interpretation of the music that's going on it. Kind of talking about each one, we've got Forevermore being the extended version, and we also have The Breath of Light being the abridged version. And I don't even know if abridged would have been a good name for this. I would have probably put concentrated or contained, because abridged feels like you're leaving something out. Because there are a number of passages that are found on Evermore that isn't found on Breath of Life. I don't feel like you're really missing anything on Breath of Life. I want to talk a little bit about these albums as a whole and what kind of unifies them. The first thing is that each of these projects are kind of a single sweep of music. It's not like Kaleidoscope or the first two albums. It's much more akin to The Whirlwind in that it's kind of a single track. More so on Breath of Life because it's a single disc, whereas Forevermore is in two discs, and it almost feels like kind of like Thick as a Brick, where it's the same song on two different albums, or I guess two different sides of the same album. And in that sense, it does feel very much like a sister album to The Whirlwind. It's not quite a direct sequel, and I had a little bit of a conversation with Pete Travis about this. You can find that up there, where he actually says that one of the concepts was that this was going to be The Whirlwind Part 2, or The Whirlwind 2. And I think that was baked into this album, kind of going into the studio, but kind of decided not to do that. So there's still a lot of Whirlwind homages and hints, not only lyrically, but also musically as well. Now, upon my first couple of listens to this overall project, I did get that Whirlwind flavor, that Whirlwind feel, but I was kind of disappointed a little bit with lack of meaty hooks, with the lack of memorable passages when I compare it to The Whirlwind, which I don't know if is necessarily fair, but when you do come into the studio with that idea of it going to be like a follow-up or a part 2, or even like a sister album, the comparisons are going to be made, and even though they kind of abandoned that, it's still present there, so I can't help but kind of notice that. Now, that was one of the things that I kind of kept in my mind, and that was upon the first couple of listens. And again, with progressive rock, you're going to need a multiple listen approach to these musics. So the more I listened to them, the more I got those themes, the more I've got those items, because unlike The Whirlwind, which was immediately grabby, like it was immediately hooky, I was immediately transported to that world, this one took a little bit longer, and I think part of that is the maturity of the band. I feel like Neil, Mike, Pete, and Rowan are much more of a cohesive band rather than a multitude of personalities in the recording studio. So because of that, the music here is a little bit more complex, it's a little bit more mature, which doesn't immediately grab the listener on the first couple of listens. This does require a little bit of work from us, the listener, but as Transatlantic fans, we are ready to put that work into it. So the more that I listen to it, the more recognizable passages were starting to come off on there. Now, the other thing about both of these projects that I particularly enjoy are the passages from other band members, because we have a lot more singing from Pete and Mike. Before, it was mainly just Neil and a little bit of Rowan every once in a while, but Pete and Mike are doing a lot of singing on this album, and I applaud that because it feels more like a Beatles track. And I mean, you don't need to look any further than The Sun Comes Up Today, the first song from the second the first song of the second album from Forevermore, which is basically just like, what is it, Because from the Beatles. 4-part harmonies that is just dripping with beauty. I love it, and there's a lot of passages on here that feel very Beatles-esque. I mean, if we're looking at other influences, you definitely have the Beatles, but there's also a lot of influences from Yes, specifically within the remembering of Tales of Topographic Ocean. There's a lot of passages that feel directly lifted from Tales of Topographic Ocean. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, that was a huge experiment from a big progressive rock band of the time. This one is as well. So let's get into some more specifics between these two albums and how they differ and how they complement one another as well. Because that's one of the things that I particularly like. Because this album is in two different expressions, they actually complement one another. And once you really get used to one album, it's a lot of fun to listen to the other album and how it differs and how that expression changes. I feel like Forevermore, the extended version, is much more of that Whirlwind sequel, that Whirlwind sister album. There's a lot more homages lyrically to the Whirlwind. Direct passages and lyrics are lifted from the Whirlwind on this part. And the other thing is this album, it shines the positives and some of the drawbacks, I will admit, for progressive rock. The one thing is when we get to those really sweet ballad moments, when we get to those sweeping soundscapes of that massive sound, it does hit extremely hard, and I find myself head bopping and head rocking pretty hard during those like big climb plateaus and those massive crescendos that we've heard from Transatlantic to this part. But it is also quite long. I mean, it's over 90 minutes, and there are a few moments where I do feel as if the music were to drag. Now, the thing that puts this over the edge is that because there's a little bit of a slog during some parts, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're boring or they're a lackluster, because even though this album is 90 minutes, I still find myself loving and devouring every moment that I am in within this album. But there are definitely some areas that I like more than others. And so it makes those moments that shine all that brighter, because I don't want to see you put work into to get to those moments, but you definitely have weathered the storm, if I'm using the Whirlwind terminology, to get to those breaths of life. Don't know if a lot of those smaller moments work, because there are a number of moments that are left off when I get to the abridged version that feel a little out of place, like feel a little bit out of concept. I feel like if they had, and this is how I would review it if I were just given this album, I feel like if you had left those tracks on a completely separate disc and then tightened it up into one disc, you probably would have had a tighter end product. And that's where I'm going to be talking about The Breath of Life, because it does exactly that. So I also really do enjoy the fact that those tracks are on here, because I feel like those are the moments that shine those spotlights on the other members, because it does fill this universe in these smaller pockets of land that you can kind of deviate and sidestep the overall big narrative storyline to just take a little bit of a breather before we continue on to a bigger track. Now, if I were to look specifically at The Breath of Life, I love the fact that this album, at just over an hour, it's 64 minutes, it packs a mighty punch, and it's much tighter of an album. It's much more succinct. So if you're not into those big, massive, epic, tracks that you have to kind of slog through to get through, this is a great entry point, because it's shorter than even the Whirlwind is by about 20 minutes. And I love how tight, how punchy, how succinct this is. It's a lot less of a slog to get through. But I will also admit, if I'm comparing these two, I also really enjoy how the Forevermore version have a lot more of these solo works. It allows each of these tracks to really stretch their legs a lot more and kind of fill out the space and test what works and what doesn't. Whereas I feel like the Breath of Life is a lot more succinct. They cut out a lot of those wandering of the landscapes, the big solo works with Roland Stoltz's guitar works or Neil Morse's keyboard solos. A lot of those are left off and cut down. So I do enjoy how The Breath of Life is a lot more punchy, it's a lot more succinct, it's a lot tighter, as a finalized project. But I also feel like because of that tightness, some of those slogs, because we don't have that, don't quite hit quite as much when we get to those bigger plateaus and those bigger crescendos. The biggest one for me is the transition between the last two tracks, which do appear on both of the albums, The Greatest Story Never Ends and Love Made Away. I feel like the wind up and punch between those two tracks isn't as handled as well on The Breath of Life when we compare it to Forevermore. And it's just a personal thing for me. I really wanted that really big wind up and punch, because when we get to The Greatest Story Never Ends, it does feel like it's a kind of a big play out, and then it just kind of stops, and then we have the Love Made Away, whereas in the other one, it's much more of a wind up, succinct punch. So that's just kind of like a little bit of a looking back and forth between these two albums. So yeah, I know I've talked a lot about this album so far and kind of where I would go for this one. If you're looking at which one to get, I believe both of these will be available on streaming services. So if you don't want to, get them both. Obviously, that's my end of the day recommendation. You got to get them both, because I feel like only getting one expression is only getting half the product. And I know it's a little bit of a marketing ploy, but they got me hook, line, and sinker in that sense, so I'm going to give them all my money in that regards. But it is kind of up to you whether you want a more succinct, punchy album within the Breath of Life version, which is, as I mentioned, punchier, more succinct, a tighter album overall, or if you want more of the wandering the landscape, bigger moments, a little bit more stretching of the legs and exploring the territory, then you're going to want the Forevermore version of the album. But as I mentioned, one of my favorite parts of this album is listening to them both and seeing where they differ and how each one actually helps one another. Because, and this is something that I really should have mentioned at the beginning, this is two different expressions, as I mentioned, but that also goes into the lyrics, because the lyrics are different on both of these albums. And who's singing is also different on both of these albums. I will say that the Breath of Life is much more of a commentary on our current standing in terms of the quarantine, the lockdown, the pandemic, and where we are, specifically within the lyrics. So in a lyrical context, I feel like the Breath of Life is much more of a commentary of where we are, whereas Forevermore is much more of a commentary of where we came from, especially when there's a lot of homages to the whirlwind and all of the concepts that are wrapped up in that album. So that's a lot to take in. Overall rating of this album, geez, if you have to ask at this point, it's definitely one that I love with my whole heart. I would go on the record to say that I need more time to actually put this in a ranking of where I like this based on the last couple of albums, because I'm still getting familiar with it, even though I've had 2 weeks with this album, 3. But I would probably put it just below Bridge Across Forever and Whirlwind. It's better, in my opinion, than Kaleidoscope and Stamped, their first album. So it's kind of right in the center. It's better than Kaleidoscope and their first album. Probably not as good as Bridge Across Forever and The Whirlwind. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. But within a year or so, that could definitely change. This is the first big release of 2021 that I've been looking forward to, and it did not disappoint. And that's where I'm at. Love it with my whole heart. I can't wait to listen really a lot more within these two different expressions of the same piece. So bravo, boys. Well done. I can't wait to see how you are going to tour this album. Once the lockdown and pandemic lifts up, because I have no idea how the live version of this project would look like. But I'm extremely excited for that, because they're going to be doing a live DVD, Blu-ray release. So I'm very excited for that. There you go. That's everything that I have for The Absolute Universe by Transatlantic. Comes out next week, I believe. So once you've heard it, if you've already heard it, or if you're watching this in the future and it's already been released, what did you think about this? Let me know if you loved it. Let me know if you hated it. Let me know all about that and what your expectations are for this album by commenting down below. And if you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. I've got different tiers for different things, and you get your name at the end of my videos. I'll put those all up on, I think it's this side actually. And it really helps me out quite a bit, and I'm ever thankful for all of your support. I've left that link for my Patreon down below for you to support. And I think that's about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.